flickering candlelight danced across the faded daguerreotype in my trembling hands. Evelyn Hartwell, just 18 years old, her dead eyes staring back at me from 1847. What the Historical Society failed to mention when they handed me this box of records was that I was on the verge of uncovering the most disturbing family massacre in all of American history. A massacre that had been carefully buried, deliberately forgotten, and was never supposed to see the light of day again. The blood had long since dried on those Pennsylvania farmhouse floorboards. But the secrets were still very much alive. Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That's how you make sure YouTube keeps showing you stories exactly like this one. What I'm going to tell you tonight is more than just a story about murder. It's about what happens when tradition becomes a cage, when family becomes a prison, and when a desperate young woman decides that death is a far better option than the life they've chosen for her. The authorities labeled it madness. The newspapers called it a scandal. But buried under decades of carefully constructed lies, I discovered something else entirely. I found the real truth about what drove Evelyn Hartwell to pick up that kitchen knife on a cold October night in 1847 and systematically murder every single member of her family. The official records were lost in a conveniently timed fire back in 1923. The surviving letters were donated anonymously to the Historical Society with one strict instruction. They were to remain sealed for 100 years. That century ended last month. What I discovered inside those yellowed pages changed everything I thought I knew about American history, about family, and about the lengths someone will go to escape a fate worse than death. This is the story they never intended for you to hear. The Hartwells weren't just any family. They were old money, Pennsylvania Dutch stock, a family that had carved its fortune from the unforgiving soil of Lancaster County since the 1680s. But wealth, as I would soon learn, can rot a family from the inside out, just as surely as poverty can destroy it from the outside. Jeremiah Hartwell, Evelyn's father, owned 3,000 acres of prime farmland and a flour mill that supplied half the county. His wife, Constance, came from an equally distinguished lineage. On paper, they were the very picture of American prosperity. In reality, they were the guardians of a family tradition so twisted, so deeply embedded in their bloodline, that it had become as natural to them as breathing. The Hartwells kept their blood pure, not by accident, not by coincidence, but through a deliberate, calculated breeding program that would make your skin crawl. For 6 generations, Hartwell married Hartwell. Cousin married cousin, sometimes even closer. The family tree didn't branch. It twisted back on itself like a serpent eating its own tail. I discovered the genealogy charts hidden behind a false bottom in Evelyn's cedar chest. Names connected by lines that should never have existed. Dates that revealed a horrifying pattern. Children born with deformities who were quietly buried in unmarked graves. Stillbirths that were celebrated because they meant the bloodline was concentrating its power. This wasn't ignorance. This was entirely intentional. Evelyn was the crown jewel of this twisted legacy. Born in 1829 to parents who were themselves first cousins, she possessed what the family called the pure blood. Beautiful, intelligent, but carrying the genetic weight of 6 generations of inbreeding. And when she turned 18, the family council made their decision. She would marry Thomas Hartwell, her own second cousin, continuing the sacred tradition that had made their family powerful and had, slowly but surely, been driving them insane. The wedding was set for November 15, 1847. Ellen had 6 weeks to accept her fate. 6 weeks to prepare for a marriage that would trap her forever in a cycle of madness disguised as tradition. 6 weeks to decide if she would become another link in their curse chain or if she would shatter it forever, no matter the terrible cost. What happened next is documented in Evelyn's own handwriting, hidden in a diary sewn into the lining of her winter coat. Page after page of increasingly desperate entries that read like the final confessions of a woman being buried alive. September 30th, 1847. Father informed me today that the arrangements are finalized. Thomas arrived this afternoon to inspect his future bride. He examined my teeth like I was livestock. Mother stood by, smiling as if this was all natural, as if I wasn't human, as if my very soul meant nothing. Thomas is 26. His left eye twitches constantly from what mother calls a family nervousness. His hands shake when he speaks. This is what our pure blood has created. The entries grow more frantic as October wears on. Evelyn begged her father to reconsider. She pleaded with her mother for mercy. She even went to the local pastor, Reverend Matthews, who turned her away, explaining that family tradition was sacred and her duty was to God and her bloodline. But what finally pushed Evelyn over the edge wasn't just the arranged marriage. It was what she discovered about Thomas during their chaperoned courtship visits. The man was more than just nervous. He was violent, unstable, and carried the accumulated madness of generations in his blood. In one entry, she describes how he grabbed her wrist so hard it left bruises, whispering that she would learn to be properly obedient after their wedding night. October 15, 1847. Thomas showed me the room where I will live after we are married. It has bars on the windows. He says they are to protect me from myself, as the family women sometimes become confused after bearing children. I saw the scratches on the walls, scratches made by fingernails from women who came before me. This room is a prison, and I am to be its next occupant. The final entries are the most chilling of all. Evelyn had reached a conclusion that would horrify anyone with a functioning moral compass. But to her tortured mind, it was the only logical solution. If the family insisted on continuing this cycle of abuse and madness, if they refused to let her live as a human being and not just breeding stock, then the cycle itself had to be broken. Permanently, she began to plan methodically, studying the family's routines, learning their schedules, preparing for what she called the Great Liberation. The weather records show it was unseasonably cold that night. A harsh wind rattled the windows of the Hartwell farmhouse as the family gathered for what would be their final Sunday dinner together. 7 people sat around that mahogany table. By morning, only one would still be breathing. Evelyn had laced the evening wine with laudanum, a common painkiller that was easy to obtain and would ensure her family slept deeply. But she didn't want them unconscious for what came next. She wanted them to understand why they were dying. She needed them to see the monster they had created. The attack began at midnight. Evelyn started with her mother, Constance, who was sleeping peacefully in the master bedroom. The diary describes it in horrifying detail. Mother woke as I stood over her bed. She asked what I was doing. I told her I was saving the future. I told her no more children would suffer as I have suffered. She tried to scream, but the laudanum had made her weak. It was over quickly. From there, she moved to her father's study, where Jeremiah often slept when he'd been drinking. The man who had sold his daughter's freedom for the sake of family tradition never saw it coming. Then her 2 younger brothers, aged 16 and 14, who would have been expected to continue the family's twisted practices with their own cousins someday. But the most chilling part of that night wasn't the murders themselves. It was Evelyn's methodical documentation of each killing. She wrote detailed notes about why each family member had to die, what role they played in perpetuating the cycle of abuse, and how their deaths would serve a greater good. This wasn't madness. This was calculated justice, delivered by a woman who had been pushed far beyond her breaking point. Thomas Hartwell, her intended husband, was staying in the guest quarters that night. Evelyn saved him for last. When she entered his room, he was already awake, alerted by some sound from the main house. The struggle was violent. Thomas was stronger than the others, less affected by the laudanum. But Evelyn's rage gave her a strength that surprised them both. The final entry in her diary, written in Thomas's blood on the wall of his room, simply read, "The chain is broken. The madness ends with me. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline." The bodies were discovered 3 days later by Samuel Morrison, a local farmer who had come to discuss grain prices with Jeremiah. What he found inside that house broke his mind. Morrison never spoke coherently again, spending his remaining years in the county asylum, muttering about rooms full of blood and a young woman who sat calmly in the parlor, surrounded by death. The sheriff, William Crawford, arrived within hours. His official report, one of the few documents that survived the convenient fire of 1923, describes a scene of carnage so systematic, so precisely executed, that it defied all explanation. But what terrified Crawford more than the murders themselves was Evelyn's complete composure when he found her. She was sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing her blood-stained nightgown, calmly eating breakfast. When Crawford asked what had happened, she simply replied, "I freed us all." She showed no remorse, no signs of the madness everyone expected. Instead, she exhibited an eerie peace, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The trial should have been a sensational event. The newspapers were ready to document every detail of what they dubbed the Hartwell Massacre. But then something extraordinary happened. The story vanished. The trial records were sealed. The newspaper coverage stopped abruptly after just 2 days. I discovered why when I found the correspondence between Sheriff Crawford and Judge Harrison Blackwood. The Hartwell family's influence extended far beyond Lancaster County. Their business relationships, their social connections, their carefully cultivated reputation as pillars of the community. All of it was at stake. More importantly, their family tradition of cousin marriage was not unique among Pennsylvania's elite families. The truth about Evelyn's motive would expose a practice that dozens of wealthy families wanted to keep buried. So they made Evelyn disappear. Officially, she was declared insane and committed to the Harrisburg State Hospital. Unofficially, she was murdered within a week of her arrival. The death certificate lists the cause as complications from melancholia, but the attending physician's private notes tell a different story. Evelyn was given a lethal dose of mercury, a common treatment for madness that was easy to overdose and impossible to prove as murder. The cover-up was meticulous. The Hartwell farmhouse was burned to the ground within a month of the murders. The official story was that a lightning strike caused the fire, but the insurance investigator's private report, hidden in the same archive box, tells a different truth. The fire was deliberately set with kerosene-soaked rags placed strategically throughout the house. They were destroying the evidence. Every member of the extended Hartwell family scattered to different states. Some changed their names entirely. Others simply moved far enough away that the scandal couldn't follow them. The family fortune was quietly divided and distributed through a network of shell companies and trust funds that made it impossible to trace back to the massacre. But the most disturbing part of this cover-up isn't what they destroyed. It's what they preserved. In a private family vault in Philadelphia, they kept detailed records of their breeding program. Generation after generation of carefully documented incest, complete with genetic charts that would make a eugenicist weep with joy. They didn't see Evelyn's actions as justice. They saw them as a temporary setback in their quest for genetic purity. The practice continued in secret. I found marriage records from the 1870s showing Hartwell descendants marrying under different surnames, but the bloodline connections are unmistakable. They learned to be more careful, more discreet, but they never abandoned their twisted tradition. What's even more chilling is the network of families who helped orchestrate the cover-up. The Blackwoods, the Morrisons, the Steeles, all prominent Pennsylvania families with their own secrets to protect. They understood that Evelyn's story wasn't just about the Hartwells. It was about a system of abuse that ran through the very foundations of American high society. The letters between these families reveal their true fear. Not that people would be horrified by what the Hartwells had done, but that people would start asking questions about their own family trees. How many other wealthy American dynasties were built on similar foundations of systematic inbreeding and abuse? How many other young women had suffered in silence, trapped by tradition and family obligation? Evelyn Hartwell had done more than murder her family. She had threatened to expose an entire social order built on secrecy, tradition, and the systematic oppression of women who dared to resist. As I sit here tonight, surrounded by these yellow documents and faded photographs, I can't shake the feeling that Evelyn Hartwell is still watching, still waiting for someone to tell her story the way it actually happened, not the sanitized version that powerful families wanted preserved for posterity. The historical record calls her a madwoman, a tragic case of hereditary insanity that claimed 7 innocent lives. But the evidence tells a different story entirely. This was a calculated rebellion against a system so twisted, so fundamentally evil, that mass murder seemed like the only escape. And perhaps most disturbingly of all, she was probably right. I traced the surviving Hartwell bloodlines into the 20th century. The family's influence touched banking, politics, industrial development, names you would recognize, fortunes built on the foundation of 6 generations of deliberate inbreeding and the systematic silencing of anyone who dared to resist. The cover-up of Evelyn's story wasn't just about protecting one family's reputation. It was about protecting an entire power structure that continues to this day. The pharmaceutical fortune that funded 3 presidential campaigns, built on Hartwell money. The industrial dynasty that shaped American manufacturing for a century. Hartwell connections run through its core. Even today, even now, the network of families that helped bury Evelyn's truth continues to profit from their silence. But here's what keeps me awake at night. In all my research, in all these documents and testimonies and carefully hidden records, I found something that suggests Evelyn's story isn't unique. There are references to similar incidents. Other young women who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Other family massacres that were too quickly explained away as madness or accident. How many other Evelyns were there? How many women chose death over the fate their families had chosen for them? And how many of their stories are still buried, still waiting for someone brave enough to dig up the truth? The official history books will never tell you about Evelyn Hartwell. They'll never acknowledge that sometimes the greatest act of sanity is one that the world calls madness. But now you know. Now you've seen the documents. Now you understand that the most horrifying monsters in American history weren't serial killers or war criminals. They were families who dressed evil in the clothes of tradition and called it love. Evelyn Hartwell killed 7 people on October 23, 1847. But she also freed herself from a fate worse than death. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what justice looks like when the system is too corrupt to provide it any other way. The candle has burned down to nothing now, but Evelyn's truth finally burns.